So this is the grave of Eshek Hopkins, and he was a Revolutionary War naval officer, and he was removed from the Hopkins burial ground to here, and with the site being unmarked besides this stone, his name being read near on the stone. So this is the grave of Charles Dow. He was a economist and a publisher. So this is the grave of Nicholas Brown. He was a philanthropist and the namesake of the Ivy League school in Rhode Island, Brown University. Sorry about that. So this is the grave of Thomas Webb. He was an author and a composer. So this is the grave of William Steer, and he was a Civil War Union Brigadier General. So this is the grave of William Avery, and he was a Civil War Medal of Honor recipient. So this is the grave of James and Arthur Fenner. James and Arthur were governors, while James was also a senator. And even though James's name's here, records show Arthur is also at this site. So this is the grave of Philip Allen. He was a Rhode Island governor and a Rhode Island senator. And in the same section, if you walk a little bit over here, this is the grave right here of Henry Smith, and he was a Rhode Island governor. So this is the grave of Edward Bannister, and he was a painter, and his marker got stolen in 2024. Where these come out of, where that is, those used to be where his marker was, but someone took it. So how could someone do that? But yeah, grave of Edward Bannister. So this is the grave of Israel Angel, and he was a Revolutionary War patriot. So this is the grave of James Simmons. He was a senator from Rhode Island. This is the grave of Thomas Burgess, and he was the second mayor of the city of Providence, Rhode Island. So this is the grave of Nicholas Cook, and he was the first governor of the state of Rhode Island. So this is the grave of William Barton, and he was a Revolutionary War Continental officer. So this is the grave of Richard Jackson. He was a U.S. congressman. And then right behind him is Charles Jackson, and he was a cotton manufacturer and a governor of Rhode Island, and a governor. Alright, this is the grave of Horace Mann, and he was an educator. This is the grave of Samuel Lewis, and he was a Civil War Medal of Honor recipient. So this is the grave of Samuel Eddy, and he was a U.S. congressman. This is the grave of Joseph Tillinghast, and he was a U.S. congressman. So one of these box tombs, right here, is James Mason, and he was a congressman. But the tombs are so unreadable, and that no one knows who's inside of who, right? Which tomb holds which people. So this is the grave of Jeremiah Brown, and he was a U.S. Senator. So this is the grave of David Howell, and he was a Continental Congressman. So this is the grave of James Brown, not the music artist. Let me just clarify that this James Brown is not the music artist James Brown. He was a philanthropist and he was a part of the Brown family, as you know, from the Brown University. So this is the grave of Declaration of Independence signer Stephen Hopkins. And as I was trying to record this, I was coming from over there, and my notes are, I was walking over here and I said Stephen Hawking. And I was like, oh no, not Stephen Hawking, Stephen Hopkins. So yeah. One of two Declaration of Independence signers buried in Rhode Island. The other, William Ellery. He was buried at the Common Burying Ground in Newport. So this is the grave of John Brown, and he was a congressman, a U.S. congressman, I should say. So this is the grave of Augustus Miller, and he was a mayor of Providence, and he died in office. So this is the grave of John Brown Francis. He was a Rhode Island governor and a Rhode Island senator. So this is the grave of James Manning, and he was a U.S. congressman. So a lot of those at this cemetery. So this is the grave of Sarah Whitman. She was an author and a folk figure, but she is probably most known for her relationship with Edgar Allan Poe. So this is the grave of Tristan Burgess, and he was a U.S. congressman and the great grand uncle of Governor Theodore Francis Green. So this is the unmarked grave of Jonathan Clark, and he was a senator. So this is the grave of Zachariah Allen. He was an inventor, industrialist, lawyer, and civic leader. So this is the grave of Lewis Richmond, and he was a Civil War Union brigadier general. So this is the grave of Samuel Bridgham, and he was the first mayor of the city of Providence. So this is the grave of Francis Wayland, and he was an educator and an author. So this is the grave of Jonathan Chase, and he was a U.S. senator and a U.S. congressman. So this is the grave of Natalie Curtis Berlin, and she was an musicologist, something like that. So this is the grave of Frank Corey. He was a Major League Baseball player who played for the Providence Grays, and there's no headstone, but he's buried 20 feet from the wall. So my guess is somewhere in this line right here, because I walked 20 feet so from the wall. So my guess is that he's in this area. So this is the grave of Samuel Foss, and he was a poet and a journalist. So this is the grave of Henry Jonas Steer, and he was an industrialist. This is the grave of Albert Duffy, and he was a Civil War Union brigadier general. So this is the grave of Charles Martin, and he was a American artist, and his name is not on the marker because he was actually probably the last one of his family to pass away, and there was no one to engrave his name on the marker.